In the serene wilderness of Finland, beneath the tranquil guise of its picturesque lakes and forests, lies a mystery that has haunted a nation for over 6 decades. On the early morning of June 5, 1960, the serenity of Lake Bodom in Espoo was disrupted by a horrendous crime that would shadow Finland for many years. 4 young campers had pitched their tent by the lake, anticipating a memorable night beneath the stars. However, come morning, Mila Björklund, Anja Mäki, and Seppo Boisman were found gruesomely murdered, with their bodies showing evidence of both stabbing and blunt force injuries. The only survivor, Nils Gustafsson, was found outside the tent, grievously wounded. The Lake Bodom murders remain among the weirdest unsolved cases in Finnish criminal history. Seppo and Tero Boisman and Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson had been close friends since they were 12, often spending nights at each other's homes. After school, both even chose the same careers as electricians. In May 1960, 18-year-old Seppo began dating 15-year-old Anja Tuulikki-Mäki. Simultaneously, Niels started dating another 15-year-old, Mila Irmeli Björklund. 2 weeks post Niels's birthday, the foursome decided to camp by Lake Bodom, situated in Finland's Uusimaa region. Mila was particularly excited about the upcoming holidays, especially since it meant not having to look after her younger brothers. While Seppo and Niels were considered responsible by their parents, Mila and Anja's parents were hesitant about the camping trip, fearing for their safety. They finally gave in after persistent pleading. The chosen campsite was a mere 30-minute drive from their Helsinki home. Arriving on June 4, 1960, Seppo brought along a canvas tent, fishing equipment, some knives, pliers, strong liquor, and light beers. Niels, on the other hand, provided bread, sausages, and snacks. That afternoon, Seppo and Niels borrowed motorcycles to transport themselves and the girls to their selected spot on the lake's south shore, a secluded and reputedly safe location on a small peninsula near the beach. After setting up camp, the young men took their motorcycles to a canteen a kilometer away, purchasing chewing gum and sodas to mix with their wine. By their return around 7:15 p.m., the area had quieted down. They settled into their snug tent, barely spacious enough for the 4 of them. The following morning, at nearly 6 a.m., 2 passers-by walking along the lake's south shore heard a noise. Seeking its origin, they spotted 2 motorcycles leaning against a birch tree and a partly collapsed tent with an indistinct figure on it. They also noticed another individual walking away from the tent into the woods, dressed in a light-colored shirt. Simultaneously, 14-year-old Olavi Kivilahti, who was waiting by the lake for his fishing companions, observed a similarly dressed young man emerging from the forest and walking southward until he disappeared from view. As the morning progressed, other campers took notice of the collapsed tent and the figure atop it. Despite many seeing this peculiar sight, it wasn't until 11:15 a.m. that someone decided to intervene, rushing to a nearby construction site to call the authorities. When the police arrived, they identified the battered individual on the tent as Niels. He had sustained severe injuries, including a swollen face, multiple fractures, and stab wounds. Inside the tent lay the other 3 campers, all with fatal injuries. Seppo with blunt force and stab wounds, Anja with multiple head injuries, and Mila with severe head trauma and multiple stab wounds. Niels was immediately taken to the hospital. Authorities hypothesized that the perpetrator began the attack by cutting the tent's drawstring, enabling a clear view of the campers' heads. This strategy trapped the victims and obscured their vision of the attacker. At the crime scene, the police cataloged various personal items and found 4 knives, none of which were the murder weapons. 2 bottles of alcohol were also found, one bearing a fingerprint which didn't belong to any of the 4. Several items were also missing, including wallets and ID cards, a knife, Seppo's leather jacket, 2 men's watches, shoes, and motorcycle keys. In the days that followed, police, volunteers, and soldiers extensively searched the campground, using metal detectors, dogs, and divers in Lake Bodom. Every item recovered from the lake's bottom was cataloged. About 500 meters from the crime scene on the roadside, a worn-out pair of brown leather shoes stained with blood was found beneath a stone. Another pair was discovered in nearby bushes. The first pair belonged to Niels and the second to Seppo. Due to the crime's violent nature, it became the police's top priority. They urged the public to share any relevant information. However, this appeal resulted in numerous false leads, including innocent people reported merely for being out late. No evidence linked these individuals to the crime, and all were released. The investigation reached a standstill with no clear suspects. Locally, suspicions arose around Carl Valdemar Gillstrom, a 51-year-old who owned a nearby truck stop and kiosk. Known for his volatile temper, Carl had placed razor blades in apples to deter children from picking them, and was a notorious drinker who detested lakeside campers. He had previously shot a man for trespassing and had a penchant for aggressive actions towards vehicles near his business. Carl always carried a hunting knife and steel pipe and had been known to lay out wooden strips with nails on the road to puncture tires. He also trespassed on campsites to vandalize tents. On June 4th, Niels and Seppo visited Carl's truck stop. Though they interacted with Carl's wife, she later informed Carl about the campers nearby. The subsequent discovery of Niels and Seppo's shoes near Carl's property raised suspicions. When questioned, Carl and his wife claimed they were home the night of the murders. A police search of their property yielded nothing, leaving locals frustrated by the perceived cursory examination and the overlooked well that Carl had just installed on his property, which only made locals more suspicious, suspecting that Carl disposed of their belongings and the murder weapon at the bottom of the well. This search left the locals very dissatisfied since they viewed it as lackluster and were especially disappointed with how they ignored the well and didn't search it. By June 9th, Niels awoke in the hospital, disoriented and in pain. His memory was spotty. On June 23rd, after his discharge, he provided a statement to the police, detailing events until the early hours of June 5th. Despite revisiting the crime scene, his memories remained fragmented. In desperation, the police turned to a professor from the University of Helsinki to attempt hypnotic regression. During 3 sessions, Niels recalled an attack by a man wielding a knife and possibly a steel pipe. His description led to a composite sketch that resulted in 50 tips and 9 arrests. A standout among the tips was 36-year-old German national Hans Assmann. On June 6th, Hans was admitted to the Helsinki Surgical Hospital with red stains on his hands and overalls. His erratic behavior and bizarre statements raised suspicions. Despite these, he was never arrested due to a purported airtight alibi. Other suspects included Pauli Luoma, caught wearing a potentially blood-stained shirt and a backpack similar to the one taken from the campers. However, his alibi was solid. Another was 15-year-old Pentti Soininen, who confessed to the crime years later but lacked credibility. The least-known suspects were 2 young men seen fishing at the lake the night of the murder. They never returned for their equipment and remained unidentified. As leads dwindled, updates on the investigation became scarcer in the media. Eventually, the case went cold. In the years following the incident, locals considered Carl the prime suspect. Even though Carl didn't resemble the police sketch, his erratic behavior drew suspicion. Mere days after the murder, he sealed his well. By the late 1960s, his wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. During a hospital stay, she confided in a friend that she believed Carl was the murderer and had provided a false alibi to the police, fearing retribution from Carl. When the police, who by then had amassed an 80-page file on him, tried to question her, she retracted her statement. Due to her unwillingness to confirm her initial claim and a lack of evidence against Carl, the police abandoned their investigation into him in September 1969. Before the investigation ended, an incident occurred where Carl, after drinking with a neighbor, suddenly became emotional and confessed. "Don't you realize it yet? I am the murderer behind the Lake Bodom massacre." The neighbor, shocked, retorted that if it were true, Carl should drown himself in Lake Bodom. Tragically, on August 2nd, 1969, Carl's body was found in the lake, the death deemed a likely suicide. With no witnesses to the confession, Carl's mental state, his intoxication, and lack of evidence, the police chose not to close the case with him as the murderer. As for Hans, in 1997, during an interview, he cryptically commented, "I can't disclose the details," when asked if he was the murderer, leading many to interpret it as a confession. Furthermore, a doctor who treated Hans wrote 3 books speculating on Hans's guilt, and even attempted to link him to other unsolved crimes. However, Hans passed away in Sweden on June 19, 1998. In 2005, police declassified their files on Hans. They revealed that in 1960, Hans had an airtight alibi. During the murder, he was with his mistress in Helsinki. Multiple witnesses confirmed his whereabouts. Other pieces of so-called evidence against Hans, like blood on his clothes, were debunked. It was red paint. Police even compared Hans's fingerprints to those found at the crime scene, finding no match. Yet, public sentiment still considered Hans a likely culprit, in part due to his resemblance to the sketch from the crime scene. However, faith in the sketch waned. It was discovered that hypnosis, used on some witnesses, could induce false memories. Furthermore, some began to suspect that Niels may have fabricated parts of his story. In 2003, due to advancements in DNA technology, the case was revisited. DNA tests found the victim's blood on Niels's shoes, but none of his own. Police subsequently developed a theory implicating Niels in the crime, suggesting a motive and detailing his alleged actions on the night of the murder. However, during the ensuing trial, the defense poked holes in this narrative, highlighting inconsistencies in the evidence and presenting counter-arguments that painted Niels in a different light. In an unexpected twist, during pre-trial detention, an officer claimed Niels had confessed, stating, "What does it matter? What's done is done." Niels vehemently denied this, and with no recordings or written statements to back the officer's claim, it was dismissed by the court. On October 7, 2005, the court found Niels not guilty, citing his blood's location inside the tent, the implausibility of him hiding evidence given his injuries, and the lack of concrete evidence against him. He was awarded about €45,000 in compensation. Post-acquittal, Niels became reclusive due to media scrutiny. He once sought compensation for defamation but later withdrew the lawsuit due to a lack of legal representation. To this day, 63 years later, the case remains unsolved.